Everybody. This is Amanda Bohl. I am with the Delta Stewardship Council, and I coordinate the Delta Plan Interagency Implementation Committee. I'm excited that we have over 43 people, around 45 people joining us this morning. So thank you all for taking some time to join this discussion. This is the first of a four-part discussion series regarding building an effective Delta Science enterprise, and precedes the Science Needs Assessment Workshop, which was originally supposed to be happening right now, but we have rescheduled it to October 5th and 6th. A little bit of housekeeping before we jump in. We do ask that you connect via WebEx if you want to see the slides, but use your phone for audio if you want to ask a question during the Q&A section at the end of our discussion today. Please mute your phones and turn off the audio on your computers so that there's no interference or background noise. And then finally, we are recording this discussion, so just be aware that whatever you say will be recorded. Today we have Jay Lund and Steve Brandt from the Delta Independent Science Board, and John Callaway, the Delta lead scientist, with us. Jay and Steve will provide background on the Delta ISB's call for forward-looking science with a focus on climate change, and specifically discuss why we're holding a Science Needs Assessment Workshop. They'll also discuss the intent and content of the advanced briefing paper that has been released, and why we're hosting this four-part discussion series. And then John will present what we understand to be the current changes and impacts of climate change. Throughout this discussion, we'll be posing questions via Mentimeter. We'll provide instructions on how to use Mentimeter when we get to that portion, so stay tuned. And then we will end today's discussion with a Q&A section, as I mentioned earlier. You'll be able to ask questions via email, WebEx chat, and orally. And when we get to the Q&A portion of the discussion, we'll provide further instructions on how to participate in that as well. So before I hand it over to Jay, I just ask that you be patient with our evolving WebEx skills. Our intent with this is to generate questions and dialogue and not necessarily master online presentations. We did, however, do a run-through, so we're optimistic that this will go somewhat smoothly today. So with that, I will ask anybody who has just joined us in the last minute or so, if you will please put your phones on mute, and also mute your computer's audio. And with that, I will hand it over to Jay Lund.
Great. If I can see the next slide, please. Great. So thank you everyone for joining today. This little slide is on sort of an overview of what the origins of this Science Needs Assessment effort. It began really in two branches. The branch on Science Needs Assessment began with a Delta Science Board letter to the DPIC Interagency group in February of 2019, so already more than a year ago. And it was in response to the revision to the Delta Science Plan, which, although the revisions to the Delta Science Plan, the updating of the Delta Science Plan, we thought had a lot of good things in it, we felt that it wasn't really taking account for the very rapid changes we're seeing in the Delta and the need for science to really prepare for these rapid changes and really get much further out ahead of the policy discussions than where we are now. And so we wrote a letter to DPIC from that experience, and expressing a desire to see a more strategic science needs assessment in addition to the regular science plans and science action plans, looking much further out into the future. The DPIC had been running a panel for several panels actually for a period of time by then, looking at long-term finance for Delta Science. And so coming off of that, we have sort of merged some of those two efforts. And so now we are doing this Science Board effort in coordination with DPIC. Another offshoot from our letter of February 2019 was a very interesting and I think very useful Science Board panel that had a series of presentations, discussions, and a nice white paper on how the environment of the Delta is changing much faster than traditional science can keep up. And I think that's going to produce is producing some very useful documentation and discussions and ideas that might help us out with this effort as well. So without further ado, I'd like to then pass this off to Steve Brandt, who will talk some about the next steps in this science needs assessment effort.
Okay, thanks, Jay, and thanks everyone for attending. I would just like to provide you with sort of a brief background on the scientific needs assessment itself, and in particular on the planned workshop. For about the past 8 months or so, we've had a planning team shown here that has really been discussing how does one put together a robust scientific needs assessment in the context of changing environmental drivers and particularly changing climate. And so what we've been doing is we developed a workshop as a primary mechanism to do the scientific needs assessment. We developed 2 overarching goals and a series of 4 major topics that we would need to consider. The idea was to have a 2-day workshop. We would have discuss each of these 4 topics, which I will talk about in a minute. And in each of those 4 topics, we would have a panel discussion followed by a breakout group. And if I could have the next slide. Oh, wait, you can, oh yeah, the overall work and workshop was co-hosted by DPIC and the Delta Independent Science Board with the council as well. We also completed a advanced briefing paper that I'll talk about. And as Amanda said, the original workshop was scheduled for today, and now it's tentatively rescheduled for October 5th and 6th. And so in place of the workshop now, what we thought we would do is begin the workshop discussion, but do it as a concept of 4 sort of pre-workshop discussions. And those would be targeted towards the 4 main questions we had posed for the workshop. Okay, the next slide. We've also completed a briefing paper, and the briefing paper is discusses the overall rationale for doing a science needs assessment, discusses the audience, it discusses various ways of doing a scientific needs assessment, and then gets into the specifics of the agenda and outline for the proposed workshop, including a detailed list of questions under each of the topics we were to discuss. And the appendices provides backgrounds on sort of like the current structure of the scientific enterprise, scientific funding in the Delta, the connection of science to management, and other topics. That briefing paper is available to look at, and I encourage you to have a look at that if you haven't seen it already. The 2 overarching goals are also listed here. One is to identify key science efforts that will provide answers and insights for likely management questions in the long term, and particularly challenges in the future related to changes in driving forces, and typically those associated with climate change. This assessment, we believe, will feed directly into the Delta Science Plan, as well as the Delta Science Action Agenda, which is scheduled to begin its sort of 4-year renewal in a month or so. The Science Action Agenda, I think, as most of you know, it largely focuses on what science do managers need to know now, whereas the scientific needs assessment we're talking about looks at what science do we need to start now to meet the challenges of managers in the near future. And these 2 efforts are complementary. They'll be going on in many respects simultaneously, and they are highly coordinated throughout. Our second major overarching goal is to discuss how to organize the science enterprise to meet these complex and changing problems. We expect that some of the science needs for the future will be more complex, that will be focused on perhaps require cross-disciplinary integration as well as trying to be more predictive. So the question is, are we ready? Are we organized well enough in order to achieve those scientific goals? Okay, the next slide. Okay, thanks. These are the 4 topics that we had planned for the workshop, and now they're planned as 4 different discussion groups. The first question, which is the one we'll be addressing today, is what do we know about projected climate change impacts for the Delta? What are we reasonably certain will happen in the future? What changes are likely, particularly related to climate change? And perhaps what do we don't know? The second question relates to what questions will that raise for management decisions? Now, we know that if we know the Delta is going to change in a certain way, what do managers need to know to effectively make decisions in that future Delta? And the third topic relates to then, if we know what the management needs are, what science needs to be done to give management the answers that they need. And then finally, given that we expect the scientific needs will demand more complex cross-disciplinary efforts, probably requiring predictive tools and so forth, what changes are needed in our science governance, science funding, and integration in order to effectively meet the needs in the future? These are designed to be sort of a progressive series of questions. Clearly, they are all intertwined with each other. Difficult to talk about science without talking about management almost in the same sentence. But put simply, we're really asking, what will happen in the future? What does that mean to management? How will science address those management needs in the future? And finally, are we coordinated and integrated enough to do that science properly? During the workshop, we also proposed in the breakout groups, even though these are very general questions, cutting across all fields of science and all fields of management questions, we thought that the breakout groups would also be topically oriented to make sure we cover a lot of the main areas of interest in the Delta, including things like water supply, flood management, habitat management, native species, invasive species, water quality, land use, and Delta as an evolving place. I think that were those 8 topics where then we would discuss each of these questions under each of those topics. So what we've done now is to set up these 4 topical areas as 4 discussions like we're having today, with the dates shown there: April 28th, June 3rd, July 28th, and September 9th. So we hope you will all participate and contribute to this. We do expect that results from these discussion groups will feed directly back in to help improve the workshop in October, as well as perhaps help us produce another document or another revision of the briefing document, so that we'll have more background information and allow us to get more deeply into the discussion topics at that workshop. So that's all I have, and I'll turn it over to Amanda again, and thanks again for participating.
Great, thanks Steve and Jay. So we have our first Mentimeter pause. We have just a few questions for all of you who are listening in. So from your smartphone or from your computer, please go to menti.com, and there should also be instructions now on your screen. You'll enter the code 18254, and that will get you into the first question. Please note that responses will not be linked back to you. And then to see the results as we're going through this, you'll have to toggle between your smartphone screen and then the WebEx. We'll be showing the results on the WebEx. So moving to the first question, as folks get into menti.com. Real basic, what kind of organization do you work for? So it would be really helpful for us to know if you work for a state or federal agency, university, local agency, nonprofit, et cetera. Let's show the results. There we go. So lots of state folks with us today, federal university. Great. We're at like 40 respondents now. I think there's like 70 folks listening in at the moment, so we'll give everyone just another few moments to respond. Okay, so it looks like we've got lots of state employees with us today, so thank you very much. Whatever agency you're with, a few from the federal government, a number of folks from representing universities, some local, some consulting, and some nonprofit representatives. So thank you all very much for being here. So moving on to the next question, just to keep us moving. Have you read the briefing paper? And we generally want to know if you have or not. That really helps us in our planning and thinking about how we hold the next and what we talk about during the next few discussions. So it'd be really helpful to know if you've had a chance to read the briefing paper yet or not. So a few more no's than yeses, which is fine because you have another 6 months to read it, so we've got plenty of time. Okay, that's helpful to know. Thank you. Next question that might require just a bit more thought. Wait till that slide pops up. Are there other questions or perspectives that the workshop should be considering? So thinking about what Steve just presented in terms of the questions we're posing in the advanced briefing paper and during this discussion series, is there anything that you feel that we're missing that we should be considering as well? We'd appreciate your thoughts right now, but if something comes to you later, please just reach out and let me know. Great, connections of social issues to climate change, environmental justice, scenarios of managed retreat, cultural changes. Okay, there are lots of others, but we probably shouldn't expand topics at this point. That's helpful to hear too. Tribal perspectives, changing demographics, okay. Independent science. Contaminants. Integrated modeling. Great. Okay, well, thank you all for those really thoughtful responses. And again, if something else comes to you, please feel free to reach out to me. Very interested in hearing anything else that may come up. Okay, so one last question at this time, and that is what timescale should we be considering? You know, again, this is kind of, you know, the Independent Science Board is interested in having us think more about forward-looking science and what things we need to be starting now, but really what is that timescale that we should be considering long-term? 5 to 25 years, greater than 25 years, greater than 50 years, greater than 100 years. Greater than 50. Okay, seems like there's a lot of interest in us considering a greater than 50-year time scale, but also some interest in the 5 to 25 and the greater than 25 as well. So, okay, well, thank you all very much for your responses. This is, as I mentioned, very, very helpful in helping us move forward. So from here, we're going to transition to John Callaway, who's going to provide a broad overview of the climate change picture in the Delta as we understand it right now. So, John?
Great. Thank you, Amanda, and good morning, everyone, and thank you for participating in our pilot discussion. We are very excited to get your input. So as Steve mentioned, the overarching question for this morning is, what do we know about this projected climate change impacts for the Delta? And this slide, of course, this isn't the Delta, it's St. Mark's Square in Venice, a very special place. Despite all of the tourists and somewhere that floods pretty regularly, they have a few inches of water that floods St. Mark's Square many times a year. It floods up to 3 feet a year. That occurred last November on one of their extreme high water events. So things here in the Delta are not nearly that bad in terms of flooding, but clearly we will have more flooding into the future with climate change. So, next slide. It is So the next slide illustrates the history of the Delta, and it's important to note that the Delta and the entire estuary were created in large part by climate change and increased inundation from sea level rise. And when we get, if we can go to the next slide, the sequence of images there that you'll see when we get there are from Brian Atwater's work, and that illustrates sea level rise over the past 15,000 years, and that this has led to the migration of the coast inland, the creation of our unusual inland delta at the confluence of the Sacramento and San Joaquin Delta. So you can see that shift, inland migration. So climate change is definitely a key part of the Delta system. So next slide. So as we said this morning, we want to briefly highlight some of the major climate change effects on the Delta to get everyone thinking about these issues, to think about the science that's necessary to better understand and prepare for these changes. And looking at the attendee list, this is going to be a review because most of you, I think, are very familiar with these issues. So I do want to acknowledge some of the recent work on the topic, including this paper from the State of the Bay Delta Science by Mike Dettinger and his colleagues. And next slide. For the Stewardship Council, we put together a climate change synthesis that was developed as a background of understanding for the ecosystem amendment to the Delta Plan. And I encourage you to look at this, the paper by Mike Dettinger, and this climate change synthesis as well for more details. So next slide. These papers and others highlight that the key mechanisms or drivers for climate change impacts are increases in air and water temperature, changes in precipitation and runoff, and sea level rise. And it is important to note that it's not just gradual annual changes in these factors, but even more importantly, extreme events and shifts in seasonal patterns that are likely to have major effects on the Delta. So that highlights, this slide here highlights those changes. So next slide. So we already asked you about the time frame of interest to address these issues. And as was highlighted, it could be, thinking about relatively short terms, anything out 100 years or more. It's important to note that across for the climate change issues, these will be more severe the farther out we look, but uncertainty in the magnitude of the impacts also will increase substantially over time. So we definitely need to act now to prepare for the future. I think that's a key lesson from the current pandemic that's relevant to climate change, but no single time scale is correct or best. Rather, we just need to be aware of the various trade-offs in terms of impacts, actions, and uncertainty. So next slide. I enjoyed seeing all of the answers of things to think about because the focus of the science needs assessment is on climate change, but we do understand that there are many other factors and changes that will be important to the overall conditions in the Delta, including social factors that were highlighted in your answers and are included on the slide, as well as biological and other biological and physical factors like invasive species and others. So I do want to highlight that how we as humans respond, what's indicated there as human or social responses, how we respond to climate change is a big unknown that will definitely have a major effect going forward. And of course, the impacts of pandemics are already on our radar, should be going into the future. So next slide. So the next three slides go back to the three main driving factors. So first, for temperature shifts, the two figures that are illustrated here are historic and projected changes in air temperature in the Delta under two different IPCC scenarios. And as you can see, the gray line before the colors start indicates historic changes, and you can see that things already are warming up, but they're likely to be much greater into the future with a 5-degree increase Fahrenheit in the moderate scenario on the left and 9 degrees increase with business as usual by 2100 on the right. So water temperatures also will increase, and this likely will be one of the greatest stressors for aquatic species in the Delta. And although obviously there will be year-to-year variability as is illustrated, the forecasts for these changes are relatively certain. So as mentioned previously, in the time frame of the next 20 to 30 years, there's much more certainty than going out to 2100. So next slide. For precipitation and runoff, the temperature shifts that are going to occur will lead to less snowmelt, with more precipitation coming as rain, and that'll occur even at higher elevations. So this will lead to earlier runoff in the watersheds, decreased delta inflows in the summer and fall. And these shifts are relatively certain given the linkage to temperature effects. However, shifts in overall precipitation are less certain, with some models predicting increases and some predicting net decreases. In addition to these shifts, we're likely to see an increase in extreme events. So I don't know if we can go to the precipitation slide. So there will be increases in extreme events with more floods and droughts and more extreme storm events. The atmospheric river events that we have are likely to become even more intense. Okay, so I'm going to keep going since we have limited time. And if we can get to the sea level rise slide, for the third factor, sea level, rates of sea level are already increasing globally, and this will lead to higher water levels and greater rates of inundation within the delta. As with temperature, these changes are going to accelerate with a range in forecasts and increasing uncertainty as we move beyond the next 2 to 3 decades. So in addition to increased water levels, sea level rise will also result in increased salinity in the delta. And it's important to note that subsidence is a key cofactor in addition to sea level rise in determining flooding risks across the delta. In large part, because of this, the impacts of sea level rise will not be uniform throughout the delta. And there is also likely to be substantial spatial variability in how the other factors, river inputs, are likely to affect the delta. This variability reflects much of what we already understand about delta dynamics. For example, that riverine inflows will not be uniform and much more important further upstream compared to sea level rise effects. Next slide. So with those mechanisms, those 3 mechanisms in mind, we can return to the original question of what this all means for the delta. So next slide. So I have 3 slides on impacts. First, thinking about water quality impacts, that changes in sea level and shifts in runoff will lead to greater salinity intrusion within the delta, especially seasonally when low flows are likely to be much less. If we think about this from a water management perspective, this means that greater freshwater flows will be needed to keep the salinity at bay and to maintain freshwater conditions at the water intakes. In addition to the direct effect of increased temperatures, increasing temperatures will lead to lower levels of dissolved oxygen in the delta waters, creating further stress for aquatic organisms. Suspended sediment concentrations will be affected by changes in overall runoff and extreme events. This has implications for tidal wetlands as well as for aquatic species that are affected by turbidity. And for water quality and all of these impacts, as we've highlighted at the beginning, it's important to note that these will happen in conjunction with other factors. In this case, future changes in contaminants, nutrients, climate change related shifts in pH. Next slide. So in addition to water quality, if we think about impacts on species and effects on their habitat, for aquatic organisms, the biggest effects are likely to be stresses related to increasing salinity and water temperature, while for wetland and floodplain species, increased inundation associated with sea level rise will be a major factor, along with increased salinity stress that will reduce plant productivity. Where possible, wetlands may migrate to higher elevations. And this is probably possible in Suisun and many more areas with few opportunities for migration within the delta. Floodplain inundation may increase, although some models show that this will be more periodic due to increased storm intensity and won't really create the sustained flooding that's necessary to support native species. So again, there's many interacting factors to consider: invasive species, both current and new, that are likely to establish, and many of them are more tolerant of higher temperatures, so this may be more problematic for native species into the future. And of course, large-scale restoration will increase overall habitat availability and improve habitat conditions going forward. Next slide. So turning to human impacts, I want to note that the Council is currently undertaking a climate change vulnerability assessment for the Delta. This includes evaluating impacts to both natural and human assets in the Delta, with a focus on human-related impacts. So as I mentioned, shifts in salinity and temperature will greatly affect water management efforts and water supply in the Delta. Both sea level rise and increased storm-related river inputs will increase flooding risks for all land uses within the Delta. And then in addition to flooding, changing temperatures will shift growing seasons with impacts on native species and on agriculture. And again, there's interactions with many other factors, from the potential for future conveyance infrastructure to shifts in environmental regulations and other approaches to management. So hopefully this rapid tour has you thinking about climate change impacts on the Delta in general, the importance and value of identifying the necessary science to address these issues moving forward. So I will turn it back over to Amanda to lead us into our discussion.
Okay, great. Thank you, John. Okay, before we go into the Q&A, we do have one final question for all of you via Mentimeter. So if you want to get your phones out again and go back to www.menti.com and re-enter the code if you need to, 18254. And pull up that first, well, the only question we have for right now. So if you're there, we want you to consider and to let us know your thoughts on whether or not there's any missing science that we need to discuss. I mean, given what John just talked about and the types of things that we think we understand or don't understand, are there other things we need to be considering? So however you define all of that, we'd appreciate your ideas and your thoughts on that question. And we'll get the Mentimeter up on the WebEx as soon as we can.
Yeah, it's currently up. I think there's a delay with the...
Yeah. There it goes, yeah. Okay. So again, is there any missing science that we need to discuss? Changing ocean conditions. And again, this is another one that, you know, if you can't think of something right now, I encourage you to reach out after this and let us know your thoughts. Onset and duration of seasonal warming. Effects of climate change on CVP and SWP service areas. Potential for evolutionary adaptation, modeling of events as well as trends. Storm inputs to water management systems, ecosystem-based management as opposed to single species. External water demands. Great. Cognitive biases that impede adaptation. Great. Okay, so I think maybe, Edmund, why don't we leave this open just a little bit longer as we transition into the Q&A, just so folks can continue to add their questions. But we'll go ahead and start to transition into Q&A just so we have plenty of time to answer questions and to have more of a dialogue around what we've been talking about this morning, or what Jay and Steve and John have been presenting. So questions can be submitted in multiple ways. So you can submit a written question using the WebEx chat function, or you can email disb@deltacouncil.ca.gov and with your question. If you're sending a question via WebEx chat, please send it to all of the panelists. That way I can see it. And then you can also pose a question orally. And if you want to do that, please use the raise hand WebEx function or email the ISB website, email address that you have an oral comment, and then we'll call on you. As a reminder, though, please keep your phone on mute until called upon. And once you hear from us and we recognize you, then we'll ask you to start speaking. So I see a hand one, let's see, I think the first hand that I see raised is from Bruce Herbold. So Bruce, if you want to go ahead and take your phone off of mute and let us know your question or your thoughts. Bruce, do you have a question for us? Okay, we'll go back to Bruce. Let's see if there's any other hands raised. Anybody else yet? I'm seeing lots of questions still coming through via the Mentimeter, so thank you for continuing to share your thoughts with us. And Edmund or Cheryl, do we have any written questions submitted?
Not by email that I see, but we do have a few comments in the WebEx chat function. Do you want those read? Yeah.
Why don't we go ahead and read those?
Okay. This one was from Josh Collins. He says, identify Delta as both the bottom of great watersheds draining from the Western Divide, as well as the regional top of the Pacific Ocean. The Delta will continue to be transitory and subject to what happened and downstream. And we also have two comments from Mike Dettinger. His first point is most of that big uncertainty 50 years is uncertainty that we have now because we don't know how society would change its greenhouse gas emissions. That means by 2050, we should know a lot more about the emissions, and by then those big uncertainties looking forward will be less than they are now. We will know better which path we're on, and so by the projections forward, and then we'll be less uncertain. And assuming that our models are better, by then our uncertainties will decline even more. So those big late century uncertainties are not written in stone when we are in the midst of those late century changes. There's hope that uncertainties will be smaller. We will always have this range of uncertainties, so plans should be able to take advantage of future, a few decades from now, reductions in uncertainties when they come. His second point, almost all the precipitation changes, runoff changes in the long haul are now known to reflect changes in extremes. So those changing extremes are at the heart of nearly all those precipitation changes. One form this will take is more of the water resource will have to come from floods, which with normal years following the declines with times. Kathleen Schaefer also noted about the need to consider effective environmental decision-making. And then Josh Collins replied back and noted opportunities for estuarine transgression, also known as migration due to sea level rise, will change as sea level rise affects property values. CV is flat. Opportunities to accommodate sea level rise through transgression in CV are likely to increase over time.
So thank you all for your comments. I do see one question from Deirdre Desjardins. Do you have any thoughts about needed hydrodynamic modeling of sea level rise in the Delta? Who wants to take that one?
I think that sounds like it's for Jay.
Yeah.
Yes. The brief answer is yes.
What are your thoughts, Jay?
I think we need more of it and more public domain modeling of it, and some more public discussion based on modeling results and some insightful modeling results, some of which I think are in the works, but they've been in the works for a long time and they haven't seen the light of day yet.
And this is John. I was just going to go back to Michael Dettinger's comments as well as Josh's comments. I think, so Mike highlighted that uncertainty is going to shift over time and be reduced as we get a better insight of the long-term uncertainty. So to me, that really points to that we should be thinking about 20 to 30, that the time frame 20 to 30 years out where there isn't so much uncertainty and where we can do some management efforts that would have some significant effect. And then in 20 to 30 years, hopefully the longer term, the uncertainty around 2100 will be reduced and give us better insight into where we might go forward. And then similarly, Josh, I think with the transgression issues highlights that things will change. It's an interaction of both climate change as well as economic issues and property values that will create opportunities for migration. So I think really pushes for what we've been trying to do at the Council of think more about how interactions between physical factors and social factors and how we can improve our understanding and decision making, incorporating those different sort of sources of information.
Thanks, John. One of the comments I just saw in response to our last question was for us to be considering these questions beyond the Delta and Suisun Marsh, that we need to be taking kind of a more holistic and kind of watershed-wide view of all of this. And I completely agree, and that's one thing that, that we've talked about both from the planning team and then also the science funding and governance initiative process that preceded this and was one of the things that the letter that the Delta Independent Science Board sent to DPIC addressed. And so the initiative and the work group that was working on those issues identified that need as well, but decided that at this point we need to focus on what we know and what we can kind of manage at the moment. But noted in a couple of white papers that they drafted that in the long term we need to figure out a way to be talking about and addressing these issues from a more watershed perspective. And so I think we look forward to, as we kind of bite off this first bit and figuring out how we can move forward looking at the greater watershed in the future.
As well as connecting up with the estuaries on the other side. Both of those connections, I think, are key.
Yes, absolutely. Okay, so Edmund or Cheryl, do you see any more questions coming in through the ISC's website or email address?
I see none by email, but I think Josh Collins sent another chat through the WebEx chat function. I'm not sure if you want to read that one. He sent it at 9:55.
Having trouble seeing all the chats, so.
I can read it if you want.
Yeah, because I'm not seeing all of it. I see part of it.
Okay. Okay, so this is from Josh Collins. He said, consider possibility that the margins of the estuary may be more dynamic and naturalistic or simply wild in the future than they have been in the last 200 years. What does this mean for native wildlife conservation and their future biogeography?
Steve, do you want to add anything?
I think one of the things we've talked about, I don't know if this relates to that or not, is certainly as you're changing these environmental conditions, particularly temperature, you change the habitat features in such a way that it will open the door to new invaders and close the door to those that are living on the margins as well. And I don't know if that kind of gets to that, but clearly that's one of the type of questions that we would hope that managers would begin to raise on this, and then talk about what kind of a science we need to address those.
We also have a comment from Lindsay. If we focus on more certain 20 to 30 years, then I worry that we would make a decision that is reasonable for the shorter time frame, but isn't helpful and maybe even harmful at a 50-year time scale.
Great, thanks, Lindsay. And I do see another question from Deirdre. What about effects on urban delta populations? The lower San Joaquin River Flood Control Plan doesn't include sea level rise. John or Jay, want to address that?
Since when did not being included in a plan ever stop sea level? You know, time and tide and plans wait for no tide, you know? Sea level rise will not wait for your plan.
Right. Yeah, and I think going back to the earlier comment of the time scales, I'm not saying only think about 20 to 30. I think in my slide out, I was trying to say, you know, we have to, I agree completely, we have to think across a range and not do something short-term that's going to cut off opportunities long-term, but probably focus more short-term where we have immediate effects and then be mindful of the longer-term implications.
Okay, so I haven't seen any new chats pop up or questions. Any last questions come through the ISD website or email address, Edmund?
I don't see any right now. Yeah,
okay.
None.
Okay, so let's go ahead and move on. So I just, actually, yeah, it's just, I want to thank everybody, or Jay, Steve, or John, do either of you have any final comments?
This has been great. This is great attendance and a lot of good input that'll be very useful to us all. So thank you all.
Yeah, I echo that, and also have a chance to, if you get a chance to look at that briefing paper and provide any comments you want, feel free to do that, and particularly on this process of whether it's been useful or not. Our next session will be on more looking at the management perspective and maybe having, or planning on having a panel of policymakers that are going to be asked the question of what do they need in this context, and there's a series of questions that we hope to propose to them, and they're in the in that briefing document.
Yeah, and I just echo the thanks and look forward to everyone continuing to stay engaged through the workshop.
Okay, yeah, thank you everybody for participating. We've taken lots of notes, and we'll be using what we've heard from all of you to inform both, the October workshop as well as the advanced briefing paper and the next few discussion series that we're holding over the next few months. So again, as a reminder, we've scheduled 3 more of these discussions, June 3rd, July 28th, and September 9th, and more information will be going out on each of those as we get closer. We would appreciate direct feedback on the briefing paper itself, and the briefing paper is available on the Council's website. Public comments on the briefing paper are being accepted until May 1st, which is this Friday, but if you send me some afterwards, that's absolutely okay as well. And then if you have any other questions or comments about today, about future ones, about the workshop in general, feel free to reach out to me at any time. My email is amanda.bowl@deltacouncil.ca.gov. I'm happy to chat about this process with anyone who's interested. So with that, I think we will close, and hopefully we'll see all of you again on June 3rd.